Agatha Raisin and the Fatal Soirée at Sir Charles Frauth's Manor. Good evening and welcome, dear listeners, to tonight's mystery. Agatha Raisin stood in the marble-floored entrance of Sir Charles Frauth's Manor, champagne glass trembling in her hand. The laughter from the ballroom had stopped. Someone screamed. Through the French doors she glimpsed a figure crumpled beneath the ancient oak tree, motionless. Another body, another mystery, and this time she knew the victim. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you relaxing at home, on the go, or somewhere a bit unexpected? Share your answer in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from our wonderful community. And do not forget to like and subscribe me for more mysteries every day. Now, let's get cozy and dive into tonight's story. Chapter 1. An invitation she couldn't refuse. Agatha Raisin stood in her cottage kitchen, still wearing her silk dressing gown at 10:30 on a Thursday morning, which was one of the small luxuries of running her own detective agency. The autumn sun streamed through the leaded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above her breakfast table, where Boswell and Hodge, her two cats, sprawled across yesterday's newspaper with that particular feline confidence that suggested they owned not just the table, but the entire cottage and possibly the village of Carsley beyond. The letter had arrived with the Morning Post, tucked between a gas bill and a flyer for a new Indian takeaway in Moreton-in-Marsh. She'd nearly missed it. The envelope was thick cream vellum, the kind you couldn't buy at the local Tesco, with her name written in elegant calligraphy that spoke of fountain pens and expensive stationery shops in London. She'd recognized the handwriting immediately, which explained why the envelope now sat unopened beside her cooling coffee while she glared at it as though it might explode. Sir Charles Frauth. Of course it was from Charles. She picked up the envelope, then set it down again. Boswell opened one yellow eye and yawned, entirely unimpressed by her dramatic internal conflict. Easy for him to be cavalier. He hadn't shared champagne and lingering glances with Charles at the Meerster Spring Ball, hadn't felt that particular flutter when Charles's hand brushed hers, hadn't endured the mortification when she'd discovered he'd been equally charming to at least 3 other women that same evening. Agatha snatched up the envelope and tore it open with perhaps more force than necessary. The invitation was even elegant than the envelope. Gilt edges, embossed lettering. An autumn soirée at Frauth Manor this coming Saturday evening. Cocktails at 7, dinner at 8, black tie. She could practically smell the old money wafting from the cardstock. What caught her attention, however, was the handwritten note at the bottom, in Charles's distinctive scrawl. "Do come, Agatha. I've assembled quite the intriguing guest list. Your detective's curiosity won't be able to resist." Damn the man. He knew her too well. She turned the envelope over and found what he'd meant. A discreet list of attendees, which was unusual for this sort of formal invitation, but then Charles had always enjoyed playing games. Lord Pembridge would be there, the pompous aristocrat who owned half of Gloucestershire and liked everyone to know it. Cassandra Vale, the mystery novelist, whose latest book had spent 6 months on the bestseller lists, and gave interviews about her research into the criminal mind, as though she'd actually solved real crimes rather than invented fictional ones. And there, third from the bottom, was the name that made Agatha's jaw tighten: Millicent Carstairs. Millicent, who'd competed with Agatha for everything from the attention of eligible men to the blue ribbon at the Carsley Garden Show. Millicent, who'd once described Agatha's detective work as quaint hobby sleuthing for a bored divorcee. Millicent, who, despite being insufferable, always managed to look impeccable and 10 years younger than her actual age. Agatha stood and walked to the mirror hanging beside the kitchen door. She examined her reflection critically. Her hair needed touching up. The roots were showing that unfortunate mouse brown she'd spent decades disguising. Perhaps a facial before Saturday. She turned her face to the light, checking for new wrinkles. Not too bad for her age, though she'd never admit what that age actually was, even under torture. She glanced back at the invitation. Charles had mentioned networking potential, hadn't he? Well, he hadn't, but it was implied. Lord Pembridge might need a discreet investigator. Cassandra Vale might want to discuss real investigative techniques for her next novel. Even Millicent's wealthy friends might require detective services, and there was a particular satisfaction in showing Millicent just how successful the quaint hobby had become. Besides, what else was she going to do on Saturday evening? Sit home with the cats, drinking wine and watching those insufferable baking shows. She was Agatha Raisin, private detective. She'd solved murders, uncovered affairs, found missing persons. A simple dinner party shouldn't intimidate her. Past romantic tensions be damned. She picked up her phone and typed out a text to Charles. "I'll attend. Don't make me regret it." His reply came within seconds. "I promise nothing but an entertaining evening. Wear something devastating." Agatha smiled despite herself. Devastating. She could manage devastating. In fact, she'd make certain Millicent casters choked on her canapes.
Saturday arrived wrapped in the kind of crisp autumn air that made the Cotswolds look like a postcard. Agatha spent the morning at Jolie's, the hair salon in Evesham where Mr. Barnabas worked miracles with color and discretion. While the foils processed, she scrolled through her phone, researching Fraith Manor with the thoroughness she usually reserved for investigating suspects. The manor had been in the Fraith family for 3 centuries, a sprawling Georgian estate with formal gardens and reputation for elegance. But buried in a local history blog, she found something more interesting. A brief mention of a death at the manor in the early 1960s. The details were vague, the incident described only as a tragic accident involving a guest at a party. No names, no specifics, just that tantalizing phrase that made her detective instincts prickle. "Darling, you look absolutely lost in thought." Roy Silver appeared beside her chair, immaculate in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her monthly heating bill. He worked in public relations in London and visited Carsley whenever he needed to escape what he called the madness of civilization. "Roy, what are you doing here?" "Same as you, maintaining the illusion of youth." He leaned closer, examining her foils. "Are you going somewhere fabulous? You only come to Jolie's when it's important." "Charles Fraith's party tonight." "Oh, Aggie. Charles's parties always end in drama. Always. Last year someone's husband showed up drunk and accused Lord Pembridge of having an affair with his wife. The year before that, 2 guests nearly came to blows over a disputed property boundary." "How do you know all this?" "Darling, I know everything. It's my business to know." He paused, his expression turning serious. "Just be careful. Charles collects interesting people the way others collect wine. He likes to see what happens when you mix them together. It's not always pleasant." After the salon, Agatha stopped at the vicarage to drop off a cookbook she'd borrowed from Mrs. Bloxby. The vicar's wife answered the door in her usual cardigan and sensible shoes, a smudge of flour on her cheek suggesting she'd been baking for tomorrow's church social. "Agatha, how very lovely. Won't you come in for tea?" They sat in the vicarage kitchen, surrounded by the comforting smell of fresh scones. Mrs. Bloxby poured tea with the calm efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. But Agatha noticed the slight furrow in her brow. "You're going to Sir Charles's dinner tonight, aren't you?" Mrs. Bloxby asked. "How did you know?" "The hair, dear. You only go to Mr. Barnabas when it's something significant. I knew the Fraith family years ago. Charles's father was a complicated man. Charming, but complicated. There were always whispers about that house." "What kind of whispers?" "Old families have old secrets, Agatha. Sometimes it's better to let them stay buried. Just promise me you'll keep your wits about you tonight." The warning sat uneasily in Agatha's stomach as she drove toward Fraith Manor that evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, but mist was rolling across the fields, turning the hedgerows into ghostly shadows. She'd chosen a midnight blue dress that was sophisticated without trying too hard, paired with heels that added 3 inches to her height and made her feel capable of conquering kingdoms. The narrow country lanes twisted through villages where lights glowed warm in cottage windows. Smoke curled from chimneys. A fox darted across the road, its eyes reflecting green in her headlights, before it vanished into the gathering darkness. When she rounded the final bend, Fraith Manor appeared through the mist like something from a Gothic novel. Lights blazed in the windows, and she could see silhouettes moving inside. The ancient oak tree on the front lawn stood sentinel, its gnarled branches reaching towards the darkening sky. Agatha took a breath, checked her lipstick in the rearview mirror, and drove through the gates. Chapter 2.
Arrivals and tensions. A valet appeared to take Agatha's car keys, which seemed excessive for a dinner party, but perfectly in character for Charles. The gravel crunched beneath her heels as she approached the entrance, where light spilled from the open doorway in a warm, golden rectangle that somehow felt more like a trap than a welcome. Charles met her in the entrance hall, devastatingly handsome in black tie, his blonde hair swept back in that careless way that probably took 20 minutes to achieve. He took her hand and kissed it with theatrical gallantry, but Agatha noticed the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something brittle about him tonight, a tension in his shoulders that his impeccable tailoring couldn't quite hide. "Agatha, you look absolutely stunning. That color suits you perfectly. You look worried. What's wrong?" Direct as ever. "Nothing's wrong. It's simply been a complicated week." He gestured toward the drawing room. "Come, let me get you champagne. The others are already here." The Manor's interior was exactly the sort of aristocratic opulence Agatha both admired and found slightly ridiculous. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across silk wallpaper. Oil portraits of stern-faced Fraith ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. Persian rugs sprawled across polished parquet floors, and velvet curtains framed windows that reflected the room at itself in dark glass. In the drawing room, a fire crackled in a marble fireplace large enough to roast an entire pig. Agatha accepted champagne from a server and surveyed the assembled guests with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read people for survival. Millicent Carstairs stood near the piano, wearing emerald silk that probably cost more than Agatha's car. She spotted Agatha immediately, and her smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Agatha Raisin, how delightful. Still playing detective, or have you found something more suited to your talents? Gardening, perhaps. Still perfecting the art of passive aggression, Millicent? You've really mastered it." Before Millicent could respond, a booming voice filled the room. Lord Pembridge swept toward them, a large man with a red face and the confident posture of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. His handshake was aggressive, designed to establish dominance. "Mrs. Raisin, I've heard about you. Solved some local murders, haven't you? Quite the little Miss Marple." He laughed at his own joke, which no one else found amusing. "I prefer to think of myself as professionally competent rather than quaintly amateur," Agatha said, extracting her hand from his grip. A woman detached herself from the shadows near the bookshelf. Cassandra Vale was younger than Agatha expected, perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She observed the room like a scientist studying specimens, her expression neutral but intensely focused. "Mrs. Raisin, I've read about your cases. The quiche of death murder was particularly interesting. You must tell me how you knew to look at the baking competition entries." Her voice was pleasant but analytical, as though she were already filing away Agatha's reactions for future reference. "Instinct mostly, and attention to details others overlook." "How fascinating. We have that in common, then. Observation is everything, isn't it?" Something about Cassandra's steady gaze made Agatha uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate why. It was like being read, assessed, and categorized all at once. A younger man hovered near the drinks table, pouring himself what looked like a very full glass of whiskey, despite the champagne being offered. He had Charles's aristocratic features, but none of his easy confidence. His hands trembled slightly as he drank, and his eyes darted around the room as though expecting an ambush. Charles appeared at Agatha's elbow. "That's my brother Gerald. He's been rather out of sorts lately. Family matters, you understand." Gerald caught them looking and quickly glanced away, then immediately looked back as though he wanted to say something but couldn't quite manage it. The nervousness radiated from him like heat from a radiator. Agatha sipped her champagne and watched the social dynamics unfold. Millicent was speaking to Lord Pembridge with exaggerated animation, laughing too loudly at something he said. Cassandra had produced a small notebook and was making discreet notes while pretending to admire the artwork. Gerald finished his whiskey and immediately poured another, and Charles moved through the room like a host in a play, charming and attentive, but with that strange tension still visible in the set of his jaw. Something was wrong here. These people hadn't gathered for a simple dinner party. There were undercurrents Agatha couldn't quite identify, relationships and conflict simmering beneath the polite conversation. She had attended enough social events to recognize the difference between normal social friction and something more dangerous. Charles caught her eye across the room and raised his glass in a private toast, but the smile still didn't reach his eyes, and for the first time Agatha wondered if accepting this invitation had been a mistake.
The cocktail hour unfolded with the surface pleasantry of a swan gliding across water, serene above, but with furious paddling happening beneath. Agatha positioned herself near the fireplace, where she could observe the entire room, a trick she'd learned during her years in public relations before retiring to the Cotswolds. Lord Pembridge cornered Charles near the window, his voice rising despite obvious attempts to keep the conversation private. Agatha edged closer, pretending to admire a landscape painting of the estate grounds. "I'm telling you, Charles, that boundary was established by your great-grandfather and mine in 1897. The deeds are perfectly clear. If you proceed with this sale, you'll be violating a gentleman's agreement that stood for over a century." "Times change, Pembridge. The agreement wasn't legally binding. My solicitors have been quite clear on that point." "Your solicitors are London sharks who wouldn't know tradition if it bit them. This is about more than property lines. It's about honor, family legacy." "It's about money," Charles interrupted quietly. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Lord Pembridge's face darkened to an alarming shade of burgundy. He opened his mouth to respond, but Charles had already turned away, leaving the older man sputtering into his champagne. Across the room, Cassandra Vale had trapped Gerald near the bookshelf. Her notebook was open now, unconcealed, and she was asking questions with the relentless precision of an interrogator. "So, the family has owned this estate since 1723? That's nearly 3 centuries. There must be fascinating stories. Deaths, scandals, the usual accumulation of history that old houses collect." She smiled, but it was the smile of a shark. "I'm researching real-life murders for my next novel, the psychology of violence in enclosed communities, particularly among the upper classes. People always assume murder is a working-class crime, but some of the most interesting cases involve exactly this sort of setting." Gerald's hand shook as he set down his empty glass. "Why would you research that here?" "Every old house has secrets, Mr. Fraith. I find real-life inspiration produces much more authentic fiction. Don't you agree the truth is stranger than anything we could invent?" "I need another drink," Gerald muttered, practically fleeing toward the bar. Millicent materialized beside Agatha with the inevitability of a recurring nightmare. She held out her left hand, displaying a diamond ring that could probably be seen from space. "I don't believe you've heard my wonderful news. I'm engaged to Marcus Thornbury. You know, the investment banker. He's worth absolutely millions. We met at the Royal Ascot. Of course, some of us are luckier in love than others, but then you have your little detective hobby to keep you occupied. How lovely for you both. I'm sure you'll be very happy. 3rd time's the charm, as they say." Millicent's smile froze. "2nd time? Oh, was it? I must be confusing you with someone else." Before Millicent could respond, Gerald's voice cut through the polite murmur of conversation. He was on his 4th whiskey, swaying slightly near the piano. "Here's to families and their secrets.
Here's to all the things we keep buried until someone decides to dig them up, until someone decides it's time for the truth to come out. Consequences be damned." An uncomfortable silence fell across the room. Charles moved quickly toward his brother, placing a hand on his shoulder with a grip that looked more restraining than comforting. "Gerald, perhaps I should what? Stay quiet? Keep pretending everything's fine? That this dinner party is actually about celebrating anything other than—" "That's enough." Charles's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Let's get you some water." At that moment, Mr. Grimsby, the butler, appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served," he announced with perfect timing, as though trained to interrupt awkward family moments. The guests began moving toward the dining room, but Agatha hung back, her attention caught by movement near a side entrance, partially hidden behind a tapestry. A woman slipped through, elegant and furtive, shaking mist from her coat. She handed it to a staff member and smoothed her dress before entering the room. Charles saw her and went perfectly still. Something unreadable crossed his face. Surprise, concern, perhaps fear. The woman smiled at him, but there was nothing warm in it. Who was she, and why had she arrived like a secret?
Chapter 3. Dinner and Discomfort. The dining room was a study in aristocratic excess. A mahogany table stretched the length of the space, set with china so delicate Agatha feared breathing too heavily near it. Silver gleamed under the light of 3 crystal chandeliers, and candles in elaborate candelabras cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. The effect should have been romantic, but instead felt vaguely medieval, as though they were all players in some courtly drama that wouldn't end well. Charles took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for the mysterious latecomer to sit at his right. "I believe most of you know Vivian Holbrook. She's recently returned from Paris." The name landed like a stone in still water. Agatha watched the ripples spread across faces. Millicent's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. Lord Pembridge's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Even Cassandra looked genuinely surprised, her pen frozen above her ever-present notebook. Vivian was stunning in the way that old money and good genetics combined to create. Tall, elegant, with dark hair and the sort of bone structure that would photograph well from any angle. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than Agatha's entire wardrobe, and she surveyed the table with cool amusement. "Charles's former fiancée," Millicent whispered to Agatha with barely concealed glee, "left him practically at the altar 5 years ago, ran off to Paris with some artist. This is absolutely delicious." The first course arrived, a delicate consommé that Agatha barely tasted. She was too busy watching the dynamics shift and reform around this new element. Gerald had returned, but he'd gone pale at the sight of Vivian, and now stared at his soup as though it contained the secrets of the universe. Lord Pembridge broke the uncomfortable silence with his usual lack of subtlety. "So, Charles, have you given any more thought to our conversation? My solicitors are prepared to file an injunction if necessary. It would be unfortunate to air family business in court, but I'm prepared to do whatever's required to protect my interests. I'm sure we can resolve this amicably, Pembridge. There's no need for threats at the dinner table." "I wasn't threatening. I was stating facts. There's a difference, though perhaps it's subtle for those who don't value tradition." Cassandra leaned forward, her sharp eyes moving between Charles and Pembridge like a spectator at a tennis match. "How fascinating. Property disputes often reveal so much about family dynamics. The things people will do to protect what they consider theirs. It's quite primal, really. I'm researching exactly this sort of conflict for my next book." "Perhaps you should write fiction and leave real people's lives alone," Charles said, his pleasant tone not quite masking the edge beneath. "But real life is so much more interesting than anything I could invent. Take tonight, for instance, a gathering of people, each with their own complicated relationship to the host. Former fiancés, family members, business rivals." She gestured around the table with her wineglass. "It's a mystery writer's dream scenario."
Vivian spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a slight French accent that Agatha suspected was at least partially affected. "Some mysteries are better left unsolved, Miss Vale. Some doors should remain closed." "How ominous! You see, this is exactly the sort of thing I mean. Subtext, tension, hidden meanings. It's delicious!" The main course arrived. Venison with seasonal vegetables, perfectly prepared, and completely wasted on a table full of people who were too busy watching each other to eat. Millicent was on her third glass of wine and becoming louder with each sip. "I think it's brave of you to come back, Vivian, after what happened, though I suppose 5 years in Paris gives one a certain thick skin, or shamelessness. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." "Millicent," Charles warned. "Oh, don't mind me. I'm just making conversation. Unlike some people, I say what I'm actually thinking rather than hiding behind polite smiles and—" Gerald stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with an ugly sound. "Excuse me, I'm not feeling well." He practically ran from the room, his napkin falling forgotten to the floor. No one moved to follow him. Charles's jaw was tight, his knuckles white around his wineglass. Vivian watched him with an expression Agatha couldn't quite read. Satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. Lord Pembridge was cutting his venison with unnecessary violence. Cassandra was writing in her notebook again, her pen moving quickly across the page. Agatha sat in the middle of it all, her detective instincts screaming that this wasn't just social drama. This was something darker, more dangerous. These people weren't just uncomfortable with each other. They were afraid, or angry, or both. Whatever Charles had assembled them here for, it wasn't friendship or celebration. It was something else entirely. And Agatha had the sinking feeling that before the night was over, she'd discover exactly what.
The dessert was a work of art. Individual chocolate soufflés that arrived at the table still rising, dusted with powdered sugar and accompanied by vanilla crème anglaise. Under normal circumstances, Agatha would have savored every bite. Instead, she barely noticed the taste as Vivian set down her dessert spoon with deliberate precision and turned to face Charles directly. "I think we've all been very polite this evening, pretending this is just a social occasion. But shall we discuss why you really invited me here, Charles, after 5 years of silence?" Her voice was calm, almost conversational, which made it more cutting. "Shall we talk about broken promises? About what you did to my family?" Charles's expression remained carefully neutral, but Agatha noticed his hand tremble slightly as he reached for his wine. "Vivian, this is hardly the time." "When is the time? You've ignored my letters for months. You refused to take my calls. So here I am, accepting your invitation, calling your bluff. Let's discuss it in front of your carefully curated audience." Lord Pembridge dabbed his mouth with his napkin, his small eyes gleaming with interest. "Ooh, this is rich. The Fraith family and their treatment of others. Perhaps Miss Holbrook and I have more in common than I realized. Your father, Charles, was a scoundrel who cheated my family out of rightful property in a business deal that would make even modern bankers blush. And when my uncle tried to fight it legally, he died under mysterious circumstances, right here at this very estate. 1962. They called it an accident. How convenient." The room went absolutely silent. Even the candle flames seemed to still. "That's absurd," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My father was a businessman, yes, but your father was a thief, and the apple rarely falls far from the tree, does it?" Cassandra had stopped even pretending to eat. She sat forward, her entire body alert with interest. "I should mention that my new book isn't actually about fictional murders at all. It's investigative journalism disguised as true crime. I've been researching the Fraith family history for the past year. I've interviewed former staff, accessed old police reports, spoken with families who've had dealings with your family over the decades. The pattern is fascinating. Convenient deaths, disappeared witnesses, silenced complaints." "You've been investigating me?" Charles's composure finally cracked, anger flashing across his face. "You came into my home under false pretenses? You invited me.
I simply didn't correct your assumptions about why I accepted. Cassandra smiled. I've interviewed everyone at this table, actually. Each of you has a story about how the Fraith family wronged you or someone you loved. I thought it would be illuminating to gather you all together, a social experiment, if you will. Millicent, who had been remarkably quiet, suddenly laughed, a harsh, wine-soaked sound. Oh, this is perfect. You want to talk about the Fraith family? Vivian here thinks Charles owes her family money. She's been threatening to go public with some sordid story unless he pays her off. Extortion, plain and simple. I have the emails to prove it. That's not... How did you... Vivian's composure finally fractured. Those were private communications. Nothing's private anymore, darling, and desperate people make mistakes. You're broke, aren't you? The Paris dream didn't work out quite as planned, and now you're back, looking for a payout from your ex-fiancé. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of Fraiths who'd commanded this estate. That's enough, all of you. This evening was meant to be civilized, and instead it's devolved into accusations and melodrama. I suggest we move to the garden. Fresh air might restore some sense of decorum. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Agatha watched him with new appreciation for his control. Even cornered, even attacked from multiple directions, he had managed to redirect the situation, to move them all to terrain of his choosing. But what was he playing at? What did he hope to accomplish by gathering all these people who clearly despised him or his family? The guests rose reluctantly, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As they filed toward the French doors leading to the garden, Agatha found herself wondering if Charles was brilliantly manipulative or desperately naive. Either way, the night was far from over.
Chapter 4. Garden of Secrets. The garden was transformed by night into something from a fairy tale, or a nightmare, depending on perspective. Japanese lanterns hung from branches, casting pools of amber light across manicured lawns that disappeared into darkness at the edges. The moon hung full and heavy above, occasionally obscured by wisps of mist that drifted like ghosts between the carefully pruned hedges. In the center of the main lawn stood the ancient oak tree, its gnarled trunk easily 6 feet across, branches spreading like arthritic fingers against the star-scattered sky. Agatha wrapped her pashmina more tightly around her shoulders. The temperature had dropped, and the mist carried with it the damp chill peculiar to English autumn evenings. The other guests dispersed across the garden like actors taking their marks, forming small clusters that excluded as much as they included. Charles and Vivian moved toward the oak tree, their body language tense despite the casual appearance of their stroll. Agatha positioned herself near a stone fountain where the sound of water would mask her presence, straining to catch fragments of their conversation. "Can't keep pretending nothing happened," Vivian's voice carried on the night air. "I've tried to make amends. What more do you want from me?" Charles's response was quieter, harder to hear. "I want acknowledgement. I want—" The rest was lost as they moved further into shadow. Near the garden's edge, Lord Pembridge had cornered Gerald beside a rose arbor. The younger man looked trapped, his face pale in the lantern light, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Pembridge's finger jabbed toward Gerald's chest as he spoke, each gesture aggressive and threatening. Gerald shook his head repeatedly, his hands raised in a placating gesture that seemed to only inflame Pembridge further. Millicent and Cassandra stood near the terrace steps, an unlikely alliance formed by mutual interests Agatha couldn't yet decipher. Millicent gestured wildly with her champagne glass, nearly sloshing the contents over the rim. Cassandra listened with that same predatory attention, occasionally making notes on her phone. Whatever Millicent was revealing, Cassandra clearly found it valuable. Agatha moved through the garden, a glass of champagne in hand, serving as her excuse to wander. She caught fragments of conversation, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. "Deserves everything coming to him." That was Millicent, her voice carrying the slight slur of too much wine. "There's legal precedent from 1893 that clearly states—" Lord Pembridge, still lecturing Gerald. "Not about money, it was never about money." Vivian, her voice cracking with emotion.
Mr. Grimsby and two staff members circulated with fresh champagne, their movements practiced and unobtrusive. Agatha accepted a new glass, even though she'd barely touched her first. Something about the butler's expression bothered her, a tightness around his eyes, a rigidity in his posture that seemed more than professional reserve. She turned back toward the oak tree, just in time to witness something odd. Gerald had moved away from Lord Pembridge and approached Charles, who was momentarily alone, as Vivian had walked off toward the koi pond. The brothers spoke briefly, Gerald's agitation visible even from a distance. Then, in a movement so quick Agatha almost missed it, Gerald's hand dipped into Charles's jacket pocket, depositing something small before withdrawing. Charles didn't seem to notice. He was watching Vivian's retreating form, his expression unreadable. Gerald backed away quickly, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his haste to put distance between them. He grabbed a champagne glass from a passing server and downed half of it in one gulp. Agatha's detective instincts, honed over years of investigating murders in the Cotswolds, were screaming warnings. Everything about this evening felt wrong. The forced gathering of people with grievances, the escalating tensions, the accusations flying like arrows, and now Gerald's furtive action. What had he put in Charles's pocket? Why did he look so terrified? She glanced around the garden, taking inventory. Charles stood alone beneath the oak tree now, silhouetted against the moonlight. Lord Pembridge had claimed a stone bench, his posture radiating indignation. Millicent was stumbling slightly on the uneven grass, her heels catching in the soft earth. Cassandra watched everyone with those penetrating eyes, her phone still in hand. Gerald had retreated to the shadows near the garden wall, barely visible. Vivian stood at the edge of the koi pond, her reflection fractured by the rippling water. The scene was beautiful, civilized, elegant, and felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Mr. Grimsby approached Charles with a tray holding a single champagne glass, clearly fresh from the kitchen. "Your champagne, Sir Charles, the Bullinger you requested." Charles accepted it with a distracted nod, still watching the garden and its inhabitants. He raised the glass to his lips. Agatha felt her heart lurch. Every instinct she possessed told her something was desperately wrong. The furtive conversations, Gerald's strange action, the way everyone seemed positioned like chess pieces on a board, and now Gerald's furtive action. What had he put in Charles's pocket? Why did he look so terrified? She glanced around the garden, taking inventory. Charles stood alone beneath the oak tree now, silhouetted against the moonlight. Lord Pembridge had claimed a stone bench, his posture radiating indignation. Millicent was stumbling slightly on the uneven grass, her heels catching in the soft earth. Cassandra watched everyone with those penetrating eyes, her phone still in hand. Gerald had retreated to the shadows near the garden wall, barely visible. Vivian stood at the edge of the koi pond, her reflection fractured by the rippling water. The scene was beautiful, civilized, elegant, and felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Mr. Grimsby approached Charles with a tray holding a single champagne glass, clearly fresh from the kitchen. "Your champagne, Sir Charles, the Bullinger you requested." Charles accepted it with a distracted nod, still watching the garden and its inhabitants. He raised the glass to his lips. Agatha felt her heart lurch. Every instinct she possessed told her something was desperately wrong. The furtive conversations, Gerald's strange action, the way everyone seemed positioned like chess pieces on a board, and now Gerald's furtive action. What had he put in Charles's pocket? Why did he look so terrified? She glanced around the garden, taking inventory. Charles stood alone beneath the oak tree now, silhouetted against the moonlight. Lord Pembridge had claimed a stone bench, his posture radiating indignation. Millicent was stumbling slightly on the uneven grass, her heels catching in the soft earth. Cassandra watched everyone with those penetrating eyes, her phone still in hand. Gerald had retreated to the shadows near the garden wall, barely visible. Vivian stood at the edge of the koi pond, her reflection fractured by the rippling water. The scene was beautiful, civilized, elegant, and felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Mr. Grimsby approached Charles with a tray holding a single champagne glass, clearly fresh from the kitchen. "Your champagne, Sir Charles, the Bullinger you requested." Charles accepted it with a distracted nod, still watching the garden and its inhabitants.
He raised the glass to his lips. Agatha felt her heart lurch. Every instinct she possessed told her something was desperately wrong. The furtive conversations, Gerald's strange action, the way everyone seemed positioned like chess pieces on a board, and now Gerald's furtive action. What had he put in Charles's pocket? Why did he look so terrified? She glanced around the garden, taking inventory.
Agatha excused herself to use the powder room, needing a moment away from the garden's oppressive atmosphere. The house felt eerily quiet after the tensions outside, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She took her time, splashing cool water on her wrists, studying her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror. Her instincts were rarely wrong, and they were screaming danger tonight. When she returned to the garden, perhaps 10 minutes later, everything had changed. The casual groupings had dissolved into confused movement. Voices called out Charles's name with increasing urgency. Vivienne stood frozen near the fountain, her hand pressed to her mouth. Lord Pembridge was bellowing orders that no one followed. Gerald had emerged from the shadows, looking around wildly. "Where did he go?" Millicent's voice carried across the lawn, shrill with whine and confusion. "He was just here! Charles? Charles?" She stumbled toward the oak tree, her heels sinking into the soft earth. Then she stopped abruptly, and her champagne glass fell from her hand, shattering on the stone path. The scream that followed was raw and piercing. Agatha ran. Years of solving murders had trained her to respond to crisis with clarity rather than panic. She reached Millicent in seconds, pushing past the woman's frozen form. Charles lay beneath the oak tree, collapsed against its massive trunk. His legs were splayed awkwardly, one arm flung out, the other clutched to his chest. The champagne glass, the special Bollinger Mr. Grimsby had brought him, lay in glittering fragments nearby, its contents soaked into the grass. "Call 999, Agatha commanded, dropping to her knees beside Charles. "Someone call for an ambulance, now!" She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse she already knew she wouldn't find. His skin was still warm but lifeless. His eyes were open, staring upward at the branches above, and his expression was one of surprise rather than pain. How long had he been here? 5 minutes? 10? Is he... Gerald's voice cracked. "Is he dead?" "Don't touch anything," Agatha ordered, her mind shifting into the clinical detective mode that had served her through multiple murder investigations. "Everyone stay back. This is a crime scene." The words hung in the air like an accusation. The other guests had gathered in a semicircle, keeping their distance. Agatha scanned their faces quickly. Shock, horror, confusion, but also, in some expressions, something else. Fear? Guilt? Satisfaction? She forced herself to observe the scene methodically, knowing that in moments it would be contaminated by well-meaning attempts to help or by the chaos of emergency responders. Charles's expression, the position of his body, suggesting he'd felt the effect suddenly, tried to reach for support and collapsed. The shattered glass, with its distinctive gold label, Bollinger, just as Mr. Grimsby had announced. A few drops of champagne still clung to Charles's lips. Poison, almost certainly. Fast-acting, given the timeline. Agatha's eyes moved to Charles's jacket. The pocket where she'd seen Gerald deposit something hung open and empty. She glanced at Gerald, who stood trembling violently, his face ashen. His eyes met hers for just a moment before he looked away, and in that instant she saw pure terror. "I've called the police," Cassandra announced, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Agatha noticed she was still holding her phone and wondered with a detective's suspicious mind whether Cassandra had been recording or photographing rather than just calling for help. Lord Pembridge had backed away from the group, his earlier bluster completely deflated. He stared at Charles's body with an expression that might have been horror or might have been calculation. Vivienne stood perfectly still near the fountain, her hand pressed to her mouth. "I didn't think... I never wanted..." Millicent had collapsed onto a stone bench, her earlier drunkenness burned away by shock. She rocked back and forth, arms wrapped around herself, making small keening sounds. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Agatha stood slowly, her knees protesting. She looked down at Charles's body one more time. the charming, troubled man who'd invited her to what he'd promised would be an entertaining evening. He'd been right about that, at least. She glanced around the assembled guests, at the ancient oak tree, at the beautiful garden now transformed into something sinister. This was the moment from the hook, the moment she'd been building toward all evening. Someone had murdered Sir Charles Fraith, and the killer was standing right here, in this garden of secrets.
Chapter 5. Locked in with a killer. The police arrived with efficient speed, blue lights strobing through the mist and casting eerie shadows across the Manor's facade. Detective Inspector Wilkes emerged from the lead car with the purposeful stride of someone who'd done this too many times before. He was a compact man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When he spotted Agatha standing near the terrace, his expression shifted through several emotions: recognition, resignation, and something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Raisin, I might have known." He approached her, his uniformed officers fanning out behind him. "Please tell me you didn't touch anything." "I checked for a pulse. He was already dead. I've kept everyone away from the body since." Agatha gestured toward the oak tree, now cordoned off by 2 constables. "The victim is Sir Charles Fraith, owner of the estate. He collapsed approximately 20 minutes ago after drinking champagne. I suspect poison." Wilkes studied her for a moment. They'd worked together, or rather worked in tense parallel, on 3 previous murder cases in the Cotswolds. He found her meddling annoying, but her instincts grudgingly accurate. Suspected poison. Based on what evidence? The speed of collapse, his expression, the fact that he'd just consumed something served only to him. She paused. And the fact that someone slipped an unknown object into his coat pocket earlier, which is now missing. You witnessed this? Yes. His brother Gerald did it, though I don't know what the object was. Wilkes' jaw tightened. Right. Everyone stays. No one leaves the property until we've conducted initial interviews. Where are the other guests? Within 15 minutes, they'd been herded into the library like suspects in an Agatha Christie novel, which Agatha noted with dark irony. The library was all leather-bound books and wing-backed chairs, a fire crackling in the grate that should have been cozy, but instead felt like they were trapped in an increasingly warm cage. Through the tall windows they could see lights being set up in the garden as forensics began their work. Gerald had refused to come downstairs, claiming illness. He'd locked himself in his room, and Wilkes had posted a constable outside his door with instructions that he wasn't to leave or communicate with anyone. Agatha filed that away as significant. Guilt, grief, or genuine illness. Vivienne sat in a chair near the window, her posture perfect, hands folded in her lap. She'd stopped crying, and now appeared almost serene, watching the police activity with detached interest. The calmness was striking given that her former fiancé had just died. Shock could explain it, Agatha knew, but so could a guilty conscience at peace with accomplished revenge. Lord Pembridge paced near the fireplace, his face florid with indignation. "This is outrageous! Absolutely outrageous! You can't keep us here like common criminals. I have a seat in Parliament. I have rights. My solicitor will hear about this treatment." "Your solicitor can hear whatever you'd like, Lord Pembridge, but you're not leaving until we're satisfied we have your full statement. A man is dead. Everyone present is a potential witness or suspect until we determine otherwise." "Suspect? How dare you suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating procedure." He turned to survey the room. "Mrs. Raisin has informed me this was a dinner party with a specific guest list. I'll need to understand each person's relationship with the deceased." Millicent had collapsed on a sofa, her perfect makeup now streaked with tears and mascara. She clutched a cushion to her chest like a shield, rocking slightly. "This can't be happening. This can't be real. Poor Charles. Poor Charles." Her distress seemed genuine, but Agatha remembered the venom in her voice during dinner. Which was the real Millicent, the grieving friend or the bitter rival? Cassandra sat in a corner chair, and despite everything, she was still taking notes.
Her phone lay on the side table beside her, and periodically she'd pick it up, type something, then set it down again. When she caught Agatha watching, she didn't look away or appear embarrassed. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile that sent chills down Agatha's spine. Mr. Grimsby stood near the door with 2 other staff members, a young maid who looked terrified, and a cook who kept twisting her apron in her hands. The butler's expression remained professionally neutral, but Agatha noticed his hands trembled slightly. He'd been the one to serve Charles that final glass of champagne. How must that feel, knowing that you'd delivered the instrument of death? Wilkes caught Agatha's eye and gave a slight jerk of his head toward the hallway. She followed him out, aware of everyone watching their departure. "I need your statement," he said quietly once they were alone. "Everything you observed, everyone you spoke with, anything unusual. And Mrs. Raisin?" He fixed her with a stern look. "This time, please let the professionals handle the investigation. This isn't a village squabble over poisoned quiche. This is murder at an aristocratic estate with potentially powerful suspects. Stay out of it." Agatha met his gaze steadily. "Of course, Inspector. I wouldn't dream of interfering." They both knew she was lying.
Agatha returned to the library and did what she did best. She listened. People in shock often revealed more than they intended, and grief or fear had a way of loosening their tongues. She positioned herself with practiced ease, drifting between small clusters of guests under the guise of offering comfort. In reality, she was collecting information the way a magpie collected shiny objects, quietly, efficiently, and with unmistakable purpose. She started with Vivienne, who still sat by the window with an unsettling statuesque composure. The forensic lights outside flickered against the glass, giving her face a pale, haunted glow. Agatha eased into the adjacent chair. "Are you all right? Can I bring you anything? Tea, perhaps?" she asked gently. "I'm fine, thank you." Vivienne didn't look away from the garden. "It's strange, isn't it? I've spent 5 years imagining this moment. Charles dead, unable to hurt anyone else. Now that it's happened, I feel nothing, just empty." "Hurt anyone else?" Agatha repeated, letting the question hang. This time Vivienne turned toward her, eyes sharp and unbearably tired. "Charles's father destroyed my family, Mrs. Raisin. A business deal in 2005 meant to save my father's company. Instead, Mr. Fraith Sr. manipulated contracts, stripped our assets, and left my father bankrupt. 3 months later, he killed himself." Her tone never wavered. It was too controlled, too worn. "I blame Charles, not for what his father did, but for refusing to acknowledge it, for hiding behind lawyers and family loyalty. That's why I left him. I couldn't marry a man who chose prestige over truth." "And tonight?" Agatha asked. Vivienne exhaled slowly. "He said he had something to tell me, something that would explain everything. I thought maybe he'd grown a conscience." She gave a brittle laugh. "But I suppose I'll never know now." Agatha left her gently and turned to Lord Pembridge, who was pouring himself an impressively large whiskey from the library's decanter. His hand trembled slightly as he stopped the pour. "Outrageous business," he muttered before she even spoke. "Keeping us here like suspects. I had nothing to do with Charles's death, though heaven knows he deserved a reckoning." "The land dispute?" Agatha asked, keeping her voice neutral. Pembridge's jaw tightened. "He was going to sell it. Land my family has used for hunting and riding for over a century. Sell it to developers. I warned him that if he did, I'd expose what his father did to acquire parts of it in the first place. Documents exist. Proof." He took a long drink. "But killing him, that would do nothing. The decision would simply pass to his brother. No, Mrs. Raisin, Charles alive was far more advantageous." Agatha filed that away. Motive, opportunity, but clever enough to avoid a plan that wouldn't serve him. Across the room, Millicent had stopped crying and was dabbing at her makeup with surprising steadiness. Agatha sat beside her. "I'm so sorry," she began softly. "I know you and Charles were close." "Were we? I came here tonight hoping to rekindle something that, let's be honest, probably meant very little to him. That engagement I mentioned, to Marcus Thornberry, completely fictional. I made it up to make Charles jealous." She snapped her compact shut.
Pathetic, isn't it? A woman my age playing games like a teenager, and now he's dead, and I'll never know if he ever cared. Were you going to tell him the truth tonight? Yes, after dinner. But then Vivienne arrived, and Cassandra started all that drama, and everything crumbled. Cassandra proved trickier. She watched Agatha approach with analytical coolness, clearly aware of the motive extraction happening around the room. Quite a night for research, Agatha offered. Indeed, though I'd have preferred a less dramatic ending. She set down her phone. My book would have ruined Charles. Generations of corruption, cover-ups, ruined lives, documented and ready for publication. He tried to stop me, of course. Threats, money. But truth has a way of surviving. So he wanted you silenced, Agatha concluded. Yes, but I'm not the one who's dead. Cassandra smiled thinly. Someone else intervened. Before Agatha could reply, motion near the servants' corner caught her eye. Mr. Grimsby, the butler, was whispering urgently to the cook, his face pale and strained. When he noticed Agatha watching, he stiffened, straightened, and wore his professional mask once more. But she had already seen the raw fear behind his eyes. Something was wrong downstairs, and Agatha intended to find out what.
Chapter 6. Midnight Discoveries. Agatha had never liked being treated like a suspect, but after giving her statement to Inspector Wilkes, who sniffed at every sentence as if testing it for lies, she was shown to a guest room at the far end of the West Wing. The room was pleasant enough, with a floral coverlet and a window overlooking the moonlit grounds, but Agatha felt no comfort settling into it. The manor was too quiet, too heavy. Every creak of the old beams carried an echo of unease. She lay on the bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. Her mind pulsed with questions. Too many loose ends, too many motives stacked like matchsticks waiting for a spark. She waited until the footsteps of the officers faded down the hall, then rose silently. "Time for a little wander," she murmured. The corridor outside was dim, lit only by wall sconces throwing soft yellow halos. The air was cool, carrying faint smells of old books, polished wood, and something sharper, fear perhaps, lingering like perfume. Agatha padded softly toward the guest rooms, pausing at Gerald's door. He had claimed to be ill, Wilkes had confirmed as much, and yet Agatha pressed an ear to the door. Silence. She tried the handle. It turned. The room was dark, empty, and far too neat. The bed hadn't been slept in. No clothes draped over chairs, no medicine bottles, no discarded tissues, nothing to suggest an ailing man had taken refuge here. Agatha's stomach tightened. Gerald was not ill. Gerald was gone, and he had slipped away before the house was locked down. She closed the door softly and continued through the corridor, moving toward the study. Charles's study had been sealed earlier, but the police tape hung loosely, as if someone had disturbed it. Agatha hesitated, then gently lifted the edge and stepped inside. Moonlight fell through tall windows, silvering the room. Papers lay scattered across the desk, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. Agatha approached, her eyes scanning the mess. Amid invoices, letters, and estate documents, a small stack of envelopes caught her attention, neatly tied with twine, hidden beneath an accounts ledger. She untied the stack. The top envelope contained a series of typed notes. Not threats, demands. Pay or I tell her husband. Pay or your reputation is finished. Pay or the affair becomes public. Agatha's breath hitched. Charles had been having an affair with a married woman, and someone was blackmailing him for it. She sifted further, finding bank withdrawal slips, all recent, all large. Whoever the woman was, her identity was missing from the correspondence, cleverly omitted or redacted. Another shadowy figure in a house already full of them. Before she could examine more, a faint flicker of warm orange caught her eye from the hall. Not from the sconces, from below. Someone was awake. Agatha followed the glow down the back staircase until she reached the kitchen. The scent of smoke and scorched paper hit her immediately. Mr. Grimsby, the butler, knelt by the old stone fireplace, feeding papers into the flames with frantic, jerky movements. "Mr. Grimsby," Agatha whispered sharply.
He jolted upright, nearly stumbling into the hearth. "Mrs. Raisin, you startled me. Clearly. Why are you burning documents at nearly 1 a.m? It's not what it looks like." "It looks," Agatha said, stepping closer, "like you're destroying evidence." He swallowed hard and sagged against the counter. "They were IOUs from Charles." His voice cracked. "He owed me money, large sums, gambling debts. If the police found them, they'd assume I'd killed him to wipe the slate clean." "So you burned them?" Agatha's tone was cool, not unkind. "I panicked," he whispered. "Charles promised he would pay me back this month. I didn't want anyone thinking I'd murdered him for it." Agatha looked at the ashes curling in the fireplace. Another motive, another lie, another frightened man. And somewhere in the house, the real killer was likely awake too, moving, watching, erasing their own trail just as desperately. Agatha stepped back from the fire, a chill crawling down her spine. Tonight was far from over.
Agatha was halfway back to her assigned guest room when a sound split the stillness of the manor, a sharp, strangled scream, high and unmistakably human. It came from the far end of the east wing. For a suspended heartbeat, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Then Agatha was moving, skirts swishing, breath quickening, her sensible heels tapping rapidly against the polished floorboards. "Not again," she muttered, dread prickling her spine. She rounded the corner to find Millicent Thornton standing rigidly in a doorway, her hands clasped over her mouth. The young woman's face was ghost white, eyes huge and glassy with shock. "Millicent, what happened?" Agatha demanded, gently pulling one of the trembling hands away. She pointed inside, her voice barely a whisper. It's Gerald." Agatha pushed past her and stepped into the dimly lit study. The fire in the grate was low, casting a dull orange glow that flickered across the room. Gerald sat slumped in a leather armchair, head tilted to one side, a half-empty whiskey tumbler dangling from his lax fingers. A folded sheet of paper rested on his knee. For a moment Agatha just stared, not in disbelief. Gerald's strange, unexplained absence earlier had already marked him as a puzzle piece out of place, but in irritation. This, she thought grimly, was far too neat. Millicent hovered behind her, wringing her hands. "I came to check on him because he never came for supper. The door was ajar and oh, Agatha, I shouldn't have looked." Agatha pushed past her and stepped into the dimly lit study. The fire in the grate was low, casting a dull orange glow that flickered across the room. Gerald sat slumped in a leather armchair, head tilted to one side, a half-empty whiskey tumbler dangling from his lax fingers. A folded sheet of paper rested on his knee. For a moment, Agatha just stared, not in disbelief. Gerald's strange, unexplained absence earlier had already marked him as a puzzle piece out of place, but in irritation. This, she thought grimly, was far too neat. Millicent hovered behind her, wringing her hands. "I came to check on him because he never came for supper. The door was ajar and oh, Agatha, I shouldn't have looked." Agatha stepped closer to the body, resisting the urge to touch anything. The smell of cheap whiskey mingled with the faint tang of gunpowder, though she saw no weapon. Her eyes flicked to the note, its crisp edges catching the firelight. She leaned down to read it. A full confession, short, blunt, suspiciously tidy. "I killed Charles to protect the truth. I can't live with what I've done." Signed, Gerald Harwood. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Very convenient," she murmured. The handwriting was the first thing that pricked her instincts. Slanted right, neat, controlled. Gerald, she had noticed earlier, wrote with sweeping, looping left-hand strokes. This was nothing like it. Before she could examine the paper more carefully, pounding footsteps thundered down the corridor. Inspector Wilkes and 2 uniformed officers burst in. Wilkes's face was pinched with fatigue and irritation, and when he spotted Agatha standing over the body, his shoulders sank. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mrs. Raisin, what did I explicitly tell you about interfering?" Agatha stepped aside, palms raised in innocence. "I didn't interfere. I discovered Millicent discovering the body. If anything, I'm a witness." Wilkes glared, but moved toward the chair, scanning the scene. "Looks like our case is wrapped up. Gerald kills Charles, guilt gets the better of him, and, well,
He gestured at the body, as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. Agatha gave a polite nod that barely masked her incredulity. Yes, very tidy, Inspector. While Wilkes directed his officers, Agatha suddenly angled her phone, snapped a single silent photo of the scene, and slipped the device back into her pocket before anyone noticed. Wilkes shot her a final warning glare. Stay out of this, Mrs. Raisin. That's not a suggestion. Back in her room, Agatha closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment as she caught her breath. The manor seemed heavier now, its silence oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets. She sat on the edge of the bed, opened the photo, and zoomed in. Gerald's limp hand gave it away instantly. The glass was still clutched in his left hand. The note, lying neatly on his right side, bore pen strokes unmistakably produced by a right-handed writer. Her pulse quickened. Staged, she whispered. Clumsily staged. Someone had killed Gerald to silence him. Someone who moved easily through the manor at night. Someone who didn't realize Agatha Raisin notices everything. The second murder didn't solve the mystery, it detonated it. And somewhere in the dark corridors of Thimbleweed Manor, the real killer was still awake.
Chapter 7. Unraveling Connections. Morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of Thimbleweed Manor, soft beams cutting across the disorder of the night before. Police forensics moved quietly yet purposefully through the rooms, photographing, dusting, and bagging evidence, while the remaining guests gathered at the long breakfast table, their faces drawn and sleep-deprived. Agatha sat at one end, her posture casual but her mind alert, spoon poised over a bowl of porridge as her eyes flicked from one suspect to another. The conversation began cautiously, polite murmurs over toast and tea, but Agatha had no intention of letting it remain trivial. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said, tilting her cup to sip. "How appearances can deceive. One might think a house this size reflects a man's prosperity, yet we all know estates can be treacherous." Cassandra, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, leaned forward. "You're not wrong, Mrs. Raisin. I've been going over Charles's records while the staff was distracted. The truth is, he was nearly bankrupt. The manor itself is heavily mortgaged. Staff haven't been paid in months, and any number of creditors were breathing down his neck. He was juggling debts like a circus performer, but one slip and everything would collapse." Agatha's brows rose, curiosity piqued. "And the land he was going to sell? That disputed property?" Lord Pembridge cleared his throat, his usual composure slightly rattled by the news. "I knew, of course. That land, my family's hunting grounds, was the only asset of any real value left to him. I was pressuring him to sell, not for malice, mind you, but to pay off debts that threatened the entire estate. He resisted, of course, stubborn as always, believing some semblance of control remained in his grasp." Vivian, who had spent the most of the morning staring silently into her cup, finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "I should confess something. I had brought funds tonight, enough to cover a significant portion of his debts. I intended to offer it in exchange for a simple acknowledgement from him, an admission of what his father did to my family. I wanted to see justice recognized. Nothing more." Her hands tightened around her teacup. "I thought I could save him from ruin. I didn't intend for any of this." Agatha leaned back, letting the weight of the revelations settle. The financial picture was shifting rapidly. Charles had been desperate, vulnerable, not just emotionally, but fiscally. Every interaction, every threat, now carried a more tangible context. And yet, Agatha murmured, almost to herself, the person who stands to gain the most from his death would have been Gerald. She paused, letting the thought hang. He inherits everything, but he's dead too. Convenient timing, isn't it? A hush fell over the table. Even Lord Pembridge's hand paused mid-tea, the silver spoon trembling slightly. Agatha's gaze swept across them all, noting reactions.
Cassandra's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, Vivian's jaw set firmly, and Millicent's face paled as if realizing the implications for her own tenuous plans. "Which brings us back to the central question," Agatha said, her tone deceptively light. "Who benefits from both deaths? Gerald and Charles are gone, debts remain, and the manor's value is, well, questionable. But someone somewhere sees opportunity in all this chaos. Perhaps someone who has been hiding in plain sight all along." She sipped her tea again, smiling faintly at the thought. Financial motives, she realized, were often the most insidious, quiet, rational, and devastatingly effective. Unlike jealousy or vengeance, money left a trail of logic that could be traced, if one had the patience, the persistence, and the eyes to see. The question lingered over breakfast, like the aroma of freshly baked bread. Who among them had played the long game, and who had simply been caught in the financial storm? Agatha knew one thing for certain. The answer was closer than anyone suspected, and she would find it.
Later that morning, Agatha found herself once again in Cassandra's study, the air heavy with the scent of old books and faint cigarette smoke. She had retrieved the blackmail correspondence from Charles's study, and now the time had come to confront the novelist. "Cassandra," Agatha began, easing into a chair opposite her, "I need to understand something. This letter, it mentions a married woman. I can't help but feel you know more than you've let on." Cassandra tilted her head, her expression carefully neutral, lips pressed together. "Do you, Mrs. Raisin, assume everyone keeps all their secrets neatly tucked away?" Agatha smiled faintly. "I don't assume, I observe, and I've observed you. Now, what do you know about this?" She placed the letter on the desk, letting it slide toward Cassandra like a silent invitation. The novelist's eyes flickered, a tiny crack in her otherwise unflappable demeanor. "Very well," she said after a moment, almost reluctantly. "I discovered it during my research for the book. Charles was having an affair, not with any of the women present tonight, at least not directly, but with Millicent's older sister, Helena." Agatha's pen hovered over her notebook, capturing every detail. "Helena. Married, I presume?" "Yes," Cassandra confirmed. "To a rather formidable London financier. I've heard whispers of his temper, his jealousy. Dangerous, Mrs. Raisin. Violent, even. Charles was deeply entangled with her, and she tolerated it until the threats and blackmail began." A sudden clarity struck Agatha, like a jigsaw piece snapping into place. "So the mysterious figure I saw arriving late at the manor, that wasn't Vivienne?" "No," Cassandra said, leaning back. "That was Helena. She appeared briefly, made her presence known, and then left, claimed she had pressing matters in London. That departure was perfectly timed and convenient." Agatha's mind raced. If Helena had left before dinner, she could have planted something, poison perhaps, in the champagne. Her presence, though brief, now held the potential for fatal action. Every late arrival, every whispered explanation, fell into a new light. Eager to validate her theory, Agatha went straight to Wilkes, pacing the familiar corridor outside the investigation office. "Chief, I have a new suspect. Helena, Millicent's sister. She had motive, she was present briefly, and she could have poisoned the champagne before leaving." Wilkes regarded her, expression stony. "That would be convenient, Mrs. Raisin, but you're forgetting one critical detail." Agatha stopped mid-step. "Which is what?" "He has an airtight alibi. London charity gala, photographed from the moment she left the manor until long after dinner. There is no way she could have committed the act herself." Agatha felt the familiar twinge of frustration that had accompanied her since the first body was discovered. A perfectly logical suspect, motive strong, opportunity plausible, yet the alibi dissolved it. The game had changed again. "Then someone else must have acted on her behalf," Agatha muttered, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "Or there's a timing trick we haven't accounted for. Either way, the solution isn't as simple as it first appeared." Wilkes merely nodded, reminding her with a subtle glance that her amateur deductions could only go so far before official interference became necessary.
Yet, in Agatha's mind, the web of connections was unraveling, piece by intricate piece. Helena's affair, the jealous financier husband, the potential accomplice, the poisoned champagne, they were all threads leading towards a hidden pattern, and Agatha Raisin was nothing if not determined to trace every one of them to its source.
Chapter 8. The Final Reveal. Agatha returned to her guest room, the manor quiet except for the distant hum of forensic activity and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. She closed the door behind her and exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the day seep out with the air. She had played detective all day, following leads, observing reactions, listening for the truths hidden between words. But now it was time to think. Really think. She pulled her notebook and the photographs she'd taken that night onto the bedspread, laying them out like pieces of a complex jigsaw puzzle. Every interaction, every whispered confession, every motive had to be accounted for. Vivienne's tragic loss, Lord Pembridge's land dispute, Millicent's fabricated engagement, Gerald's mysterious disappearance, Helena's brief arrival, the blackmail, the poisoned champagne. Each detail had been stored in her mind, catalogued, and cross-referenced. Her eyes drifted to the notes Cassandra had taken throughout the weekend, pages of meticulous, obsessive observations. Who said what? Who moved where? Who reacted how? Agatha recalled Cassandra's comment over dinner. Real-life murders offer the most insight for my writing. Insight, indeed. Or perhaps planning. A thought clicked into place. What if Cassandra wasn't merely researching for a novel? What if she had been orchestrating events, observing human behavior not to write about it, but to manipulate it? Agatha felt a shiver run down her spine. A writer of mysteries, skilled in plotting, would understand not only opportunity, but subtlety. They would know how to guide people, nudge them toward actions that serve a larger design. And then it struck her, the timing of the poisoned champagne. Everyone had assumed Helena, arriving late, might have done it, but the alibi confirmed she had left before dinner. That meant the poison wasn't administered until everyone was in the garden, mingling and distracted. Who could move freely among guests, unseen, and handle an untraceable substance without suspicion? The answer was staring at her all along: Cassandra. She recalled Gerald's frantic whispering that night, his sudden disappearance, and the memory card he had slipped into Charles's study. Not poison, not a weapon, but information. A protective act rather than a murderous one. Gerald had understood something, realized Cassandra's hidden intentions, and tried to leave a record for someone trustworthy to discover. That someone, clearly, was Agatha. Agatha's mind raced as she replayed moments of observation. Cassandra's calm demeanor when accusations flew, her unnervingly analytical eyes that seemed to measure not only intent, but potential outcomes. Every subtle hint, every pause in conversation, every precise word of advice had guided people in exactly the directions Cassandra wanted. And the motive, it had to be personal, not merely for intrigue or excitement, but something that would drive a brilliant mind to murder. Agatha considered Charles was arrogant, manipulative, used people for gain, and humiliated those who crossed him. Gerald, too, had knowledge of too much. Cassandra's writings were about secrets and consequences. What if she had been silenced or challenged or threatened by knowledge that Charles and Gerald possessed? Eliminating them allowed her to protect her story and assert control over the narrative. She traced a finger along the line of evidence spread across the bedspread. The champagne, the manipulated timing, the access to everyone, Gerald's memory card, the untraceable poison. Everything aligned. Cassandra had been there the entire time, observing, noting, subtly orchestrating every clue, every character trait, every motive, funneled into a pattern only she could execute. Agatha leaned back against the headboard, a small, satisfied smile playing across her lips. The pieces fit. The murderer was a writer of mysteries, skilled in human psychology, meticulous in planning, and hidden in plain sight. Cassandra.
Her pulse quickened with anticipation. Now she needed to confirm it, to gather proof without alerting the cunning novelist who had woven an entire weekend into a deadly story. Gerald's memory card held part of the answer, and Agatha had the rest in her mind, waiting for the perfect moment to bring the plot to its shocking, inevitable conclusion. As the Manor's shadows deepened outside the window, Agatha realized something else. The truth was not just about who killed Charles and Gerald, but about understanding how a mind like Cassandra's operated, anticipating the next move before the murderer herself even thought it necessary. And Agatha Raisin, as ever, was determined not to be outwitted.
Agatha stepped into the library, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, a comforting backdrop for a scene that was about to become anything but. Wilkes had gathered the remaining guests, Vivian, Lord Pembridge, Millicent, and the quietly tense Cassandra Vale herself, into a semicircle. Agatha took a deep breath, savoring the familiar thrill of a classic reveal. "Thank you all for joining me," Agatha began, her voice steady, yet carrying the undercurrent of authority she always summoned when untangling a particularly knotty mystery. "Over the past 24 hours, we've uncovered many truths, some painful, some inconvenient, and some deadly." She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Every eye turned toward her, anticipation hanging thick in the air. "I've been observing, questioning, and piecing together each thread of this story. From financial pressures to hidden romances, every person here has had motives and opportunities, but none acted as the killer," she continued, glancing briefly at Lord Pembridge and Vivian, who both nodded subtly. "Except one." Her gaze settled on Cassandra, whose expression remained cool, as though expecting the accusation. Agatha allowed a deliberate beat to pass. "Cassandra Vale is not who she claimed to be. She is, in fact, Cassandra Fraith, Charles's half-sister." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Millicent gasped. Vivian's hands tightened in her lap. Even Wilkes raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. Cassandra's eyes flickered, just a hint of panic before her professional mask returned. "Years ago, Charles's father had an affair with Cassandra's mother. That affair destroyed a family and culminated in her mother's tragic suicide. That wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of neglect, manipulation, and betrayal. Cassandra spent decades planning revenge, carefully observing the Fraith family and everyone connected to it. She laid her hand on the memory card that she had retrieved from Charles's study. Gerald discovered Cassandra's true identity and intended to leave proof, a memory card revealing her past and her connection to Charles. But Cassandra saw that and acted. She killed Charles for abandoning her family legacy and Gerald to protect her secret. Cassandra's composure faltered slightly, but she spoke with a measured calm. "It's true. I wanted justice. I wanted what was taken from my mother to be acknowledged, even if it meant taking matters into my own hands. Justice." Agatha's voice was sharp but controlled. "Murder is not justice, Cassandra. Revenge only poisons the avenger as thoroughly as any substance could poison the victim." Tears glistened in Vivian's eyes as she whispered, "I understand now. Charles's death, Gerald's, it's clearer why these things happened." Millicent nodded, relief mingled with sorrow. Even Lord Pembridge exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as the truth finally emerged. Cassandra's confession, backed by the memory card evidence, left no room for doubt. Wilkes stepped forward, gently taking her into custody, his expression unreadable but professional. Agatha watched carefully, the weight of the weekend's events settling over her. Later, back in her cozy Carsley cottage, Agatha sank into her favorite armchair. The Cotswolds' morning light streamed through the window, illuminating her little study. Her cats wound around her ankles, purring contentedly, grounding her in warmth and calm after the storm.
She sipped her tea, reflecting on the twisted path of revenge and the delicate, sometimes dangerous threads that connect people across time and circumstance. The phone rang, startling her. On the line was Vivian. "Agatha," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you. Knowing the truth, it's given me peace. I can finally move forward, without anger clouding everything." Agatha smiled, a sense of closure washing over her. "I'm glad, Vivian. Sometimes the hardest poison to remove is the one in the heart." As she set down the phone, she gazed at her cats curled in the morning light and allowed herself a rare, contented sigh. The Manor mystery was solved, justice, of a sort, had been served, and the world felt, for the first time in days, a little safe, a little cozy. The danger had passed, the deception revealed, and in the gentle warmth of her cottage, Agatha Raisin allowed herself a rare, contented satisfaction. The mysteries unraveled, and the lessons learned settled comfortably like the sun across the Cotswolds hills.